Welcome to the Imaginative Storm podcast. I'm your host, James Nave. My guest today is Julia Cameron, author of The Artist Way. Julia is also a poet as well as a screenwriter, a songwriter, and a woman who's written very many books, including The Artist Way. In this podcast, Julia will be talking about a book she recently published titled The Listening Path, The Art of Attention. And she will also read some of her poetry and reflect on the writing process and the creativity process as well. So here's Julia Cameron. So it's my pleasure to welcome Julia Cameron to Twice 5 Miles Radio. Welcome, Julia.
Good to hear you. It's a happy thing to talk with you. I always feel that you're so eloquent. It cheers me up.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad that you feel that way. When you and I first met, and I often tell people about that, there was a snowstorm happening in Boulder and you had done a workshop. And one of the reasons we connected was because you and I had poetry in common. And we also spoke of your hometown, Chicago, and you told me you had been on the mic at the Green Mill at a poetry event. And of course, I had the similar experience there as well. And after that, you and I exchanged some poetry. So why don't we begin with our time together on a poetic note? And I know that you love poetry, and it's been a part of your life since you were a young writer early on. So talk a bit with us about your relationship to poetry and how it has informed the work that you've done over your career.
Well, I feel like poetry is my secret vice. I write poetry whenever I'm at my wit's ends. Whenever I have an overwhelming crush, I write poetry. Whenever I have despair, poetry ventilates feelings. I find myself expressing things in poetry that I hesitate to express in prose, just because poetry serves better. So I'd like to read a couple of poems. You can gauge for yourself if I missed my calling. I sometimes think I should have been a full-time poet because that's where my heart is. This poem is called Remembering. I was not there when your mother bore you. Surely you came into this world hungering and wet. We all do that. Surely you came like the rest of us from that dark sea of souls, that sighing that brings us forth and calls us back. We all share that. If this is true, and it is, even for you, why are you a broken glass smashed against the floor? Why not the sea's grass on the ocean floor? Why not a smooth stone, a willow in the wind? Why do you break, not bend? And even broken, why not mend? You do know how. Walk with me to the edge of the city. Take off your shoes and feel the earth. It is softer than a woman. It is safer than your father. It is water. It is air. It is where you are returning with this yearning you can't name. Cast off your shame. It's an old coat. Remember who you are. You are a star, a mountain, that fountain in the sun. Your heart is the velvet cave where birds sing. Are you remembering?
Thank you, Julia. Do you have another one you could offer us?
Come to me. There is no darkness in which I cannot see you. Come to me. My green heart holds your ancestors. They are waiting to hear your dreams. Speak to them. They know your name. Do not imagine you are alone. Do not imagine they have left you. They are listening, waiting for your voice. Come home. All of us are waiting. Every bird remembers you. The lion, in his pride, still knows your name. The gazelle, the snake, the silver heron lifting at the shore. All these and more, your family. Come back to me. You do not need to grind your bones to dust, rusting your heart. You are known to us. Only come home.
Thank you, Julia. In that last poem, you said they are listening. And one of the things I've always enjoyed about poetry is that it requires attention, awareness. In the artist way, you early on and talk about awareness, paying attention to things. And it also asks us to listen with our ears and listen with all the other senses as well. I remember when you and I have done some things together over the years. In the middle of your teaching, you would often stop and say, I'm going to pause for a moment and listen. And then you would cock your head to the side and listen, and you nod your head and you'd come back and maybe you'd change course, or you would have a comment that you had heard from your listening. So how does listening dovetail with poetry, and how does that work for you as a poet?
Well, I think I'm listening for the sound beyond the sound. I'm listening for what you might call a secret message. I'm listening for a hint of where I'm meant to go. I think that poetry opens an inner door, and that all of us listening to poetry have a feeling of deeper connection. I'd like to read you another poem. I believe we have a lot of mythology that says poetry is written out of pain, but I believe poetry is written from ecstasy. So I'm going to read you a couple poems. For this poem, I want you to pretend I'm a man. It was written initially for a wonderful talent named Tim Weeder, and it's called Pear. It's like this. There is a pear on the table. Its flank is every woman I have ever known. There are flowers in a vase by the window, peonies, lilacs, anemones, tulips. Their petals are every woman I have ever known. The flesh of the pear, the scent of the flower, the soup boiled down from parts. Our hearts are like this, the mixture as before, but one thing more, you are my water. So the following poem I wrote when I was falling in love, and it sort of celebrates the incredible bliss you feel when you connect to another spirit, when you really connect. It's called Jerusalem is Walking in This World. This is a great happiness. The air is silk. There is milk in the look that comes from strangers. I could not be happier if I were bread and you could eat me. Joy is dangerous. It fills me with secrets. Yes, kisses in my veins. The pains I take to hide myself are sheer as glass. Surely this will pass. The wind, like kisses. The music in the soup. The group of trees laughing as I say their names. It is all Hosanna. It is all prayer. Jerusalem is walking in this world. Jerusalem is walking in this world.
Beautiful. And poetry comes from ecstasy rather than pain. That is true for me. And I do love it when a poet comes from that place of love, of expansion. And so as you move through your work and your career, how often are you able to generate more poetry in these moments of change?
Well, poetry comes to me like a nighttime visitor. It comes knocking at my door, whispering, pay attention to me. Pay attention to me. And so I stop, I pause, I listen, and I write down what I hear. I would say we talk a lot about the muse, and typically people think of the muse as being a female figure. But my experience as a heterosexual woman is that the muse for me has been a man. And when a muse comes close to me, I get all fluttery. And being fluttery, I take to the page.
So somebody out there listening to this conversation you and I are having, they may be thinking, oh, wow, I would love to take to the page too. I think you've already given a fair amount of encouragement in that direction. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to say to the poets out there who are maybe just thinking about answering the call, the muse's knock, the whisper in the evening or at night?
Well, I think it's important to keep one ear cocked to the universe. I think poetry is expansive, and we may dream a larger dream than we live. And what happens with poetry is that we're suddenly given words for a bigger self. I think I'd like to read another poem in answer to your question. How do you get bigger, big enough to write poetry? We are all Africa, the moist darkness, the beast moving through the trees. We are jungle, waterfall, the pitched screaming of a bird we cannot name. I am the light on the flank of that mountain, looming above the plain purple as a bruise. What is there to lose? I am the okapi, leaping in the air, and that there, the great and quiet snake, larger than a tree limb, draped across our path. We all change shape. In the morning light, I am bright in my darkness. Panther is just another word for night. You got that right. That is part of me. But we are all Africa. And it is not the dark which makes this right. There, from that still lake, see the shape I make? A rosy pink that rises like applause. I sheath my claws. I feather my furred nest. This is the best. I wheel like music. We are all that winged thing. We are all Africa. If I can say it, so can you. The rain comes across the plain on legs like mine. We are all Africa.
Oh, that was very, very nice, Julia. Thank you so much for reminding us that we can all be big, like the continent of Africa. And as you delve into your poetry, you've already told us that you're listening in a way that you've learned to listen over many, many years. So could you expand a bit on how listening plays into this work you're doing as a poet, also as a creative, as a writer, as a person who is called to sit every day in the writing practice and make things happen? How does listening play into all of that work that you're doing and that you continue to do and are enthusiastically finding wonderful success all along the way?
Well, I think this is a good cue for me to talk to you a little bit about my most recent book, The Listening Path. It is a book entirely devoted to the art of listening. It has 6 parts. It opens with 3 tools from the artist's way that people are familiar with. They are morning pages, which is listening in the morning to what crosses your mind and writing it down. Artist dates, which is an expedition once a week to do something festive, where you listen for your delight, and walking, where you connect to your environment, and hunches, intuitions, and guidance. So those 3 tools open the book. Then we have chapter 1, listening to your environment. And what we find is that very often we don't listen to our environment. We have a soundscape that we are largely unconscious of. And so we may start the day with a very unpleasant shrill from the alarm clock. And instead of going to get an alarm clock with a nicer shrill, we just sort of tune it out and bear with it. So throughout the day, we have many subtle sounds: the ticking of the kitchen clock, the chime of the dog's dog tags against the water bowl, the honking of horns when we drive to work. So I ask you to keep track of these sounds and ask yourself, can I change anything to give myself a more pleasant soundscape? So you may take a busy road to work with lots of honking horns, and you say to yourself, oh, I could take a different route, a quieter route. And you do that, and you have a sense of power and connection. So connecting to your environment gives you a heightened awareness of your own place in the scheme of things. The second chapter is a chapter about listening to others. And what we find is that we don't listen to others. We tend to interrupt them and say what we think they're going to say next. And so what I ask you to do is to focus on holding your tongue, on not interrupting, on listening to hear what your partner really has to say. And what we find is that they have fascinating things to say. They have a great deal of story, which only comes to mind when we're quiet. So listening to others is the second week, and it gives us a heightened sense of connection. We listen to others with body language, as well as language of the tongue. So then the third one is listening to our higher self. And very often we don't listen to our higher self. We have an issue and we think, who can I ask about this? And we cast about for our acquaintances for an expert, rather than saying to ourselves, maybe I know the answer to this question. Maybe I have wisdom. Maybe I should be listening to myself. So when we listen to ourselves, we come away with a heightened sense, I would say, of gratitude for our own wisdom. The fourth chapter is one I was terrified of. I wrote it and I thought, oh, Julia, your readers are going to think you're too woo-woo. And it's a chapter called Listening Beyond the Veil. And in it, I talk to making contact with people who have passed on that we loved, that we can still hear from them, still talk to them, that we have a connection, that it isn't gone with the physical passing of the body, that it remains a part of the ethers. And I talk particularly about two women, a woman named Jane Cecil, who is an actress, and Jane was a mentor of mine in New York, and I talk to her every day. And I talk to Jane now, and she sounds just like Jane. I listen, and she says, I'm right by your side. There's no error in your path. There's no need for anxiety. You are led well and carefully. And she's very reassuring. Then I talked to allegrahuston, whom you remember, Nabe. Allegrahuston raised championship Morgan horses, and she still talks like she's in a horse show ring. She'll say to me, Julia, you're a champion. I give you a blue ribbon. So she sounds positive and affirming. And she says, I give you stamina and grace. And I experience stamina and grace when I ask for help from Alberta. So I taught in London, and I was dreading week 4. I thought they're going to just say you're crazy. But what I found was that week 4 was their favorite week of the book, that people had just been waiting for someone to come along and give them permission to connect. So week 4 is listening beyond the veil. Week 5 is listening to your heroes. This is when you connect to people whom you admired, but you didn't know. So I'm a lyricist, and I connect to Oscar Hammerstein. But as an animator, you might connect to Walt Disney. As a poet, you might connect to Rumi. You connect to your heroes, and you're often a little bit worried that you're bothering them. They're perfectly happy in the afterlife, and you're tapping on their shoulder saying, oh, but what about me? But what I have found is that they are delighted to hear from you, and they answer promptly and clearly, and with a great sense of grounded wisdom. So that's week 5, which brings us around the clock to week 6, which is listening to silence. Because what I have found is that when we listen to silence, we actually hear sound. We hear the still small voice. And I have a friend who's terrified of silence. And I said, oh, please just try it. And he said, Julia, you don't understand. I have my radio, I have my TV, I have my internet, I have all my devices. And you're asking me to be quiet? And I said, yes, try it for 2 minutes and call me back. So we hung up, and I waited 2 minutes listening to silence myself. And the phone rang, and it was my friend Jerry calling, and he was excited. And he said, well, it was terrifying, but I tried it. And I got the best idea for work this week. And I said, well, that sounds like inspiration. Do you think you'll try it again? And he said, well, actually, I need inspiration. So I will try listening to silence. So that's the listening path.
Thank you, Julia. And if you don't mind, I'd like to pause for just a moment and say you are listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave, always broadcasting first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI-FM, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com, if you'd like to know more about Walter's music. If you would like to reach out to me, jamesnave.com is a great place to start. I would love to hear from you, especially if you have any questions about your work in the artist way or questions about the artist way in general. You can always email me through my website, jamesnave.com. I would love to hear from you and hear your stories about creativity. So now let's return to my conversation with Julia Cameron, author of The Artist Way. and work with it. And as usual, the more I work with it, the deeper I go. So I really, really do appreciate your work there. I'm wondering, when you talk about the people that you admire, the heroes, the people you look up to, like, say, Rumi or other poets or whomever, and then I'm also thinking about the people you listen to as your friends beyond the veil. And I've known you and admired you for this for years. You have that ability. And I'm wondering if people out there listening who may not have had the same comprehensive experience you've had communicating beyond this dimension we're in, is it something that one can just sit in silence and practice? And there must be lots of ways to hear from the people you love who've gone on, other than just maybe hearing it as I might hear your voice right now.
So is your question, how hard is it to learn to listen?
That's the question.
And I think it's much easier than we would imagine. I have a girlfriend, a psychic intuitive author named Sonia Choquette. And Sonia is a fourth generation psychic. And she scolds me. She says, don't think it has to be difficult to hear beyond the veil. It's natural. It's normal. It's easy. Just try it. So what the book does is invite people to just try it. And what I found is that people come back delighted with a sense of greater possibility.
One of the things I've been trying, which is an extension or maybe in addition to what you're talking about, I've been listening to the trees, and I've been communicating, at least attempting to communicate with the ravens and the crows and the animals that are around. It's a wonderful thing to think that we can just listen to all kinds of creatures out there, including the ones who have passed on that we call human.
Yes, I think listening may be an art, but it's an art that is easily practiced. And the tool at the beginning of the book, walking, invites us to listen, as you said, to trees, to ravens, to hawks, to many different creatures and many different levels of creatures. And I think that it's with a feeling of celebration that we connect. And I think that the celebration is that we are all part of a greater whole.
You have a great body of work, speaking of a greater whole. Many, many offerings that lots and lots of people have enjoyed, learned from, expanded their lives. They've learned to listen, as I have, working with your material. And now we're in this emerging time. We're coming out of this pandemic. And I recently had the opportunity to facilitate a course based on your book, It's Never Too Late to Begin Again. I had lots of people in the workshop who were younger being 37, 40, not retiring. And that book is focused on the people who are retiring. And it dawned on me that we have all, in a sense, been retired by this collective experience we've had. So as you are moving forward in your work, I would love for you to reflect on how you are calibrating your thinking. And a big compliment that I got from a lot of the students in direction of the work you're doing now, and I will echo that and second that, to say that in that book, The Listening Path, which I have and I've been reading, and also It's Never Too Late to Begin Again, you've always been able to put layers into every paragraph. It's very easy to read and easy to embrace. And yet when I go back and read it a second time, I see another layer and another and another. And in the work you're doing now, I'm spotting more and more layers, a level of awareness that can only come from a rich career. So how are you engaging in your work during this time?
Well, I'm doing something interesting for me. 20 years ago, when we knew each other, I wrote a book called The Right to Write. And you may remember that you figure prominently in The Right to Write.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about my friend, the poet Jamesnave. So it's 20 years later, and I'm one more time writing about writing. And I find that what has happened to me over the 20 years that have passed is that I have greatly mellowed. I'm much more tender-hearted. I'm much more vulnerable. So every day I write on the writing book, and I find myself hoping that when I have finished it, it will connect with people. They will read it and say, oh, I never thought of writing that way.
Well, on that note, there are a lot of people listening to this show who write, and many probably would like to begin writing. Perhaps you might have some thoughts for folks that are wanting to write. We've already talked about how to engage the poetry, and now that we've turned our attention to your new book, perhaps you have some thoughts on writing as well.
Well, I think I want to go to poetry. And I remember saying to you that it was born in ecstasy, and that my muse were masculine. I saw a stag in the city, velvet horned, sweat soaked, reeking musk and manure. Alone at dawn, he made his way north. Every cloven hoofprint, a cleft promise in the snow. Oh, how I miss your animal breath, the casual warmth of your body. I saw a stag in the city. We speak in tongues, my mouth to your ear to my mouth. We speak in tongues, use body English, mouth to mouth, heart to heart, parts of speech, each. Our every slip of the tongue is graceful. Our best syllables are silent. We speak in tongues. Our skins make conversation. Talk to me. This is a poem for unrequited love. I fell in love and he didn't fall in love back. And I found myself writing a poem about that uncomfortable fact. You are a far country. Wind is the native tongue. Distance is the custom. Out of touch is the rule of thumb. It would take body English to cross your border successfully. The natives all play dumb. In my country, there is tea, sandwiches, a softly played piano, 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 pianissimo. In your country, there are drums. The drums through the trees sound to my ear like thunder. Your body shudders with the same drawn-out note. All my niceties, the tastes I've acquired, get mired down in the thick of your tricky weather or slide away. I watch my tea cart skid across the floor. When I ask you, more? I do not mean anything we drink from a china cup, and there is not enough. In your country, dark is more visible than day. Only fly-by-night can get it right. Flying blind, over jungle, with no place to land. You reach from the open cockpit to feel rain on your hand.
That took me back to Africa a bit. Somehow I had the image of small plane, bush pilot flying it, or maybe landing it somewhere in Africa and putting the hand out and the warm rain of Africa falling on the hand. Poetry must be informing this book you're writing now about writing. The images in your poetry are always vivid, and you present those images and the ideas in a very vulnerable way. I'm wondering if you think vulnerability might sit at the gate of writing.
Well, I think vulnerability, as you put it, sits at the gate to writing. We have a mythology that says that writers are tough, invincible, steely. But my experience is actually that writers are tender, and that when we write from the heart, we connect. What I'm trying to do with this book is urge people to connect to their heart, and by connecting to their heart, connect to their audience. A lot of times we think, I don't want to write it. What if nobody wants to read it? What I say is just try writing it and trust that there will be an audience. And there is.
That's very true. And you said earlier in our conversation that you wondered if maybe you had missed your calling and should have been a professional poet instead of a professional writer. One of the things I like about poetry is that it very little of us except to just be within our poetic sensibilities. And it will dwell within us as easily as we can connect to it. So there's no commercial requirement with poetry. There's only the invitation to show up and maybe only write 2 words. Just be there as you are with your work.
I'd like to say that one of the fruits of our friendship was that I was able to urge you to go for a master's degree in poetry. I remember when we first talked about it, you were like, Julia, I can't do that. But then what happened was you realized you couldn't not do that, and that you had a great hunger for more information about poetry. So you enrolled in a master's program and tutored yourself in the wonderful poets that we have practicing today.
I remember you encouraging me. I have to go a little further here and say, you were the one who convinced me to do that. It went well beyond encouragement, and you were so insistent. And I remember we were at your house, and I was hemming and hawing, and you said, "Call them now." And I called and got a good reception. And a week later, you may not remember this, a week later, I was at the library in downtown Taos, and you pulled in right behind my car, and you got out and you said, "Nave, I have something for you." And I said, "Well, what is it?" "Here's your reference letter," which I still have in my drawer here in Taos. And it was a fantastic letter. And I included that in my application. And you said, "Now you have no more excuses. Send that application tomorrow." And I said, "Okay." And so you are the one who talked me into doing that. I would not have done it. I was in a massive, as you wrote in The Artist's Way all those years ago, I was in a massive creative U-turn curve, and you straightened me out and said, "Go do that and don't give it another thought." And I did. So I thank you to this day for encouraging me to do that, Julia. I don't know if you remember that story or not, but that was how it happened for me.
I think we have come full circle. You had a poem called The Road
Mm-hmm.
that was for many years a manifesto of yours. And you had a dog named Traveler.
Mm-hmm.
And you and Traveler took to the road and spread poetry wherever you went. And now you've had 14 months of being in one place. And I find you're still spreading poetry.
True. Yeah. When I was getting ready to do this interview, the only thing I could think about was Julia's just got to bring her poems to the show. And that's where you and I started. And I'm glad that we are staying in that vibe. And that poem about the road, it started out, the road is in love with me. She comes turning out of my childhood, twisting through my morning, interrupting my picnic. She taps when I'm asleep like a kitten, wishfully waiting for the door to open. I'm always dreaming of her. As a child, I would stand beside her and watch her as she stretched in the summer afternoon, so concrete, so eternal. As a young man, she held my hand and carried me through the gate, past my school with its oak wooden floors and wide eastern views, past my church, so small now, inadequate steeple, stained glass windows, past gardens with corn so high I'm sure it only grew to give the wind a place to go, past my father's blows and mother's easy words, carried me away from home until I stand before you right here today, breathing and alive. The road is in love with me. And that's a poem I wrote years ago. And I've been off the road now, but the poetry road belongs to all of us, belongs to you and to me and to the rest of us. So in closing, do you have a poem you would like to take us out on, Julia? I'd love to hear one last poem before we say goodbye.
This poem is called Why We Write. There are many things which resist naming, and that is why we write. We write because language is slippery and truth is. We write because the light we have to see by is always shifting. Never forget that writers are prophets. We speak in tongues. We testify. We are for each other a believing mirror. Our words make us visible. Our listening makes us heard. Never forget that writers are soldiers. Our writing is the long march, the walk into time. Each word is a drum. We sound it across great distances, reaching one another and ourselves. Every poem is a day's march, a celebration more necessary than water or wine. Every poem is a drink of blood. Never forget that writing is an act of courage. Not on the days when it is simple and we discount it. Not on the days when it is hard and we write like sand. Our words are torches. We pass them hand to hand and mouth to mouth like a burning kiss. Never forget to say thank you. Every syllable is a grace.
That's a wonderful way to close a poem. Every syllable is a grace. It's such a pleasure to swap the poetic vibe back and forth with you, I have to say.
I just feel that we have a connection, to sound too woo-woo, through ESP. We connect to our audience, and we have a feeling of great grounding. And I'm grateful for the chance to talk. And I'm grateful that we've remained friends these many years. Grateful that you write poetry.
And I'm grateful that for the same thing. I'm always thankful to hear from you. And sometimes you'll ring me in a time when I'm just standing there, maybe even thinking about you. And I'm equally grateful that you write poetry and that you were willing to bring such a volume of work to this hour. I really appreciate that. And I'm thankful that we've had this friendship all these years. It's a pleasure to have you in my life and also a pleasure to have you on this show. So thank you for all of that. I really appreciate it. And before we say goodbye, For people out there listening, if they would like to learn more about your work and your workshops and the things that you are involved in, how could people learn more?
JuliaCameronLive.com has my plays posted and my music posted. And it's under a category called Julia's Art. I have a colleague who's going to be on the show with you soon named Nick Kapuscinski. And Nick is a marvelous poet and a marvelous actor. And if you're curious about my plays and his acting, I urge you to go to JuliaCameronLive.com.
All right. Thanks for that, Julia. And again, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And there you go, my friends. Julia Cameron on listening. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Imaginative Storm podcast. I'm your host, James Nave. If you would like to join me and my creative collaborator, Allegra Houston, any Saturday, 12 noon Eastern Time for our Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week gathering. It's a salon, a conversation, and a workshop. It's always free, and imaginativestorm.com is where you can find that Zoom link. It's at the top of the fold, so maybe we'll see you live on Saturday. Thanks again for tuning in, and I do hope you tune in again next time. Till then, I'll catch you somewhere down the line on that turnaround.